We've got two more immediate events in the near future. On October 31st, Dr. Clarence Wardell and his colleagues, some from the volunteer or digital volunteer community, emergency responders, will be having a panel discussion for the rollout of the report on the social media and emergency management workshop report. And on November 1st, the day after, we've got a panel discussion on private sector innovation for emergency communications, which will include social media, geospatial, and other technologies. So with that, I'd like to introduce our speaker today, Gisli Olafsson. He's the Emergency Response Director for NetHope. NetHope is a consortium of 33 of the world's leading non-governmental organizations. Gisli leads the coordination of information and communication technology for the NGO community. He has 25 years of experience in the IT industry and 18 years of experience in the disaster field. He's one of the leading researchers and contributors to the Disaster 2.0 report, which you can find outside, that Harvard Humanitarian Initiative and John Crowley led, and also has worked with such groups as the Standby Volunteer Task Force, Crisis Commons, and the Crisis Mappers. So with that, I'll turn it over to Gisli. Sorry.
Thank you. I think we'll keep this one for the question sessions. I decided to write or put together a slide deck to kind of get you thinking a bit about where we're heading. And it came about with me starting to do a lot of reading over the last few months. And now I have to switch on two computers so that our online audience can also see. And doing a lot of reading, but also looking very closely into the way we're doing things and how technology is affecting the way we do things in the humanitarian response field. And within myself, I've had this growing feeling that there is a need to rethink a lot of what we're doing. Now, interestingly enough, you kind of have two sides when it comes to this. You talk to the digital generation, the crowdmongers or whatever they want to call themselves, and they think the solution to everything is to utilize social media and crowdsourcing. Whereas you go from the other extreme, which is, the traditional humanitarians who say, crowdsourcing, we can't use that. That's, useless data. The truth of the matter is that we have to meet somewhere in the middle. And when we meet somewhere in the middle, we need to do it so that we're working together towards that goal. And that's kind of what I feel my role has been for the last year, has been talking very often to both sides and trying to push the crowdsourcing community towards the humanitarians and the humanitarians towards the crowdsourcers. But I wanted to kind of give you an insight into some of the thinking that I've been doing around where I see things moving and how we should be maybe in some places thinking about doing things completely differently from what we have been doing before. And I'm going to be basing a lot of the structure of this talk on the format that Don Tapscott has used in his Wikinomics and macro-Wikinomics talks around the last year or so. And one of the key things that he's been pointing out is that, we're at a certain turning point. We've had these institutions that were built during the industrial age, and we're still trying to utilize them to deal with problems in the information age. And the big question is, what do we need to do to move ahead? Do we take the old institutions and throw them away completely, or do we find ways to adapt them to the way we're doing things in the information age? And we're seeing a lot of changes happening everywhere in the last few years. And in many ways, I want to say that maybe what we've seen change in the last 5 years in the humanitarian world is completely, or is more than we've seen in the last 50 years there. So there's a lot of opportunity for making different kind of approaches. And my intention here today is to give you some of my views about how we could go there, but not necessarily say that those are the only ways or the right way or the way that we should move everything. Now, looking back almost 6.5 years ago, we had the Southeast Asia tsunami. And at that time, we realized that the way we'd been doing things until then didn't scale. It didn't scale up to these big mega disasters like the tsunami. Yet we keep getting more and more of those, and Haiti was a good example of that. We had after the tsunami, we had 600 organizations responding within the first 6 weeks. It almost took 1 week or 10 days to get up to that number in Haiti. And the total number, when I went there last summer, of organizations that have registered with the government is close to 4,000. Now, how are we going to do all the coordination we've been doing if the scale has gone up that much? In the Humanitarian Response Review, when we did that, we were dealing with how do we figure out how to deal with those 600 organizations? Well, let's create a thing called a cluster, and everybody who's dealing with health can move to the health cluster. The health cluster alone in Haiti was 600 organizations. Okay, so how are you going to scale that? And one of the things we need to think about is how do we, are there ways in which we should be looking at this from a different angle to address the issue? Now, I like putting quotes, and there's a bunch of quotes in there in this presentation, and what I want to say is we can't just continue and think that things are not going to change. The next big disaster, we're going to have even more organizations. We're going to have even more complexity. Yet, we still want to use the same model, even though it's broken. We still want to move forward, even though it's broken. And we need to start thinking. We created the cluster system 6 years ago, and it's gone through, its childhood in Pakistan earthquake, and so over to Haiti and more recently now in Horn of Africa. But it may work for the smaller ones, but it definitely is breaking when we go to the big ones. And we need to realize that the changes that have happened since we introduced that model have been so tremendous, especially when it comes to things like connectivity. It used to be a great excuse not to share information that I simply couldn't, or it cost me $6 a megabyte. That was a great excuse. We now have, starting at the end of this year, we're going to be able to have a VSAT connectivity in any disaster within 24 hours. That's the government of Luxembourg has standby planes ready with VSAT kits that are going to go whenever the UN asks it. Okay? That means we're going to have VSAT connectivity when we show up there. So connectivity, we now are at the verge of solving, I would say. And with the more increased resiliency of mobile networks, we're also seeing in like Japan, where actually satellite communication was at a minimum. Most of them used standard 3G connectivity to do most of the work. So with connectivity changing, I think it's time for us to start thinking about how are we going to reform the humanitarian response for the next decade, or maybe just for the next 5 years because things are moving so quickly. Now, in his talks, Don Tapscott has identified a few principles of the information age. And I'm only going to go through a few of them here and kind of talk about how, through those principles, we're going to have to think differently about what we're doing. And let's just jump into them. Hang on. Here we go. Let's start with the innovation. We all know that we need innovative ways around how to deliver these services. A disaster environment is a very chaotic environment, and we must find ways to deal with that and find ways to now connect much more to the affected community itself. And if we're going to do that, we need new and innovative ways. But as always with new and innovative ways, it's more a question of figuring out whether we're willing to try out those new ways. As this quote says, it's very difficult to teach an old dog how to sit. And I think that's, in particular with us in the humanitarian community, we like to do things as we've always done them, because it's always worked. But what if it isn't working anymore? And what if the way we did things isn't working? Are we willing to open our eyes and do certain things? And, I speak with a lot of the NGOs, and when I spoke to them 2-3 years ago, and I talked to them about social media, it was like, social media, no, that's the dangerous thing. Our people are going to be blogging in the field about the work they're doing. It's actually, today, that's becoming commonplace. It's becoming commonplace for them to tweet from the field, to send even podcasts or videos out from the field. And it's actually helping create much more awareness about the work they're doing. So through the few that dared to take the first few steps, we now have this happening. And here in the U.S., we point towards things like Hurricane Irene. And in my mind, that was a tipping point for the use of social media in emergency management organizations, where every single emergency management organization in the track of Hurricane Irene was using Twitter and Facebook and other things to communicate with the affected communities. So let's be open. Let's be open to new ways, and let's try to rethink parts of the way we deliver aid today. Now, we've had great examples of how social media is giving us new things, but we must be open to more than just that. We must be open to the fact that aid may be delivered by different organizations than we have thought of before, including the private sector. And Craig Fugate, the head of FEMA, always gives the example of when he was down in Florida heading the Florida Emergency Management Agency, of them setting up a water and food distribution point in the parking lot of a Walmart. And the Walmart opened up their store before they managed to have the distribution point ready. We need to stop thinking always about, hey, we can fly something in from somewhere and do something. We can send the experts from abroad to come in and do things. We now have a way to communicate directly with the affected communities, with the private sector organizations in that community, and we must think of new ways to leverage that to do the work we're doing. We also need to think about how we can utilize mobile technology. To give you an example from Horn of Africa, in the Dadaab refugee camps that I visited a few weeks back, there are now over 500,000 refugees. This is a camp that was built for about 92,000 people 20 years ago. And now it houses, almost double the population of my home country, Iceland, in less than 50 square kilometers. And interestingly enough, 63% of those refugees have mobile phones. Okay? The way we're doing business today is we are handing out food, for example, through a voucher system. So people get a printed out voucher that they then take to the NGO that is handing things out, and in return, they get food. Now, the cost of printing a single voucher in such a way that it cannot be duplicated and cannot be, falsified is about $1.60 per voucher. Okay? Multiply that by the 500,000, people who are there. And remember, this is being done on a weekly basis. Okay? Now think about utilizing mobile technology for doing the same thing. We could either use mobile technology that already exists, like the M-Pesa system and other things, or we could simply create something that uses is like a mobile voucher system. The average transaction cost for a transaction in the M-Pesa system is 3 cents versus $1.60. Add to that all the ability to do tracking and analysis of the data and all of that. That's what I'm talking about, thinking about new, innovative ways to solve the issues we have been doing so far. And we can utilize this and go even further and utilize technology to help us buy and sell some of the things we need from other areas that are not affected by the disaster. So think of these ways when you think about innovation, is that we need to start looking at how this way of communicating with people in disaster-prone countries has changed. And very soon we will have that almost everywhere we go, most of the people will have access to mobile phones. And if they don't, well, we don't have to think very much about the saving, but to the remaining percentage that doesn't have the mobile phone there, it saves up with one distribution of food to give them all a cheap mobile phone. So let's move over. We also need to think about how we can utilize the same kind of technology like mobile phones to determine where the affected communities are and what their actual needs are. Now, we did see an initial trial of this in Haiti in the report that Leah mentioned before, where we started to try to gather some of those needs. But we need to do that in a much more structured manner so that we actually can get a very comprehensive and detailed information about what the exact needs are and where they are. And there are some interesting research coming out now where we're looking at mobile phone data at the operator level to determine how people are moving. And one of the big things we always in the humanitarian world need is to know where are the IDPs, where are the displaced people. And we can actually start seeing that on a map with live data from the mobile operators if we start working with them directly. And then we can start targeting groups in certain areas and say, if you are in this area here, we are going to be distributing food at this particular location. And we need to figure out how we leverage that and how we work together to do that. And it's not enough if we're simply doing this, one by one, trying out little pilots here and there. We need to figure out how is the comprehensive model for doing that. And that brings me to collaboration. Now, when we define the word collaboration, we actually normally talk about working jointly with someone which we are not immediately connected. So how do we get someone to work with us? Well, we have very much in the humanitarian world not necessarily focused on collaboration, but more around coordination. And I want to kind of talk about how we need to rethink that model. And when I do that, I want to start by talking about some research that a great professor from University of Colorado in Boulder, Dennis Milletti, did. And what he pointed out to us after doing 40 years of research on the behavior of people and organizations in disasters was that during disasters, organizations become a problem. Why does he say that? Well, because they fight turf wars. They fight turf wars over who gets the attention from the public, from the media, who gets to do what, and all of a sudden these political battles, and I can tell you stories about how there were political battles within the UN down in Haiti that cost lives, probably hundreds of lives, because it wasn't the mandate of the UN peacekeeping force to help out with a natural disaster. And it took a Security Council resolution to change that. Okay? That's what I talk about, political battles. However, what Professor Milletti pointed out to us is that there is a solution to this problem, and it is people. And it's the people who work inside those organizations. And if they know that there is someone else there working that they know, they start reaching out to those, and things happen through those personal connections. Now, interestingly enough, he did a survey and found out that 70% of emergency managers in the U.S. did not realize that things happen through personal connections. So we need to think about how could we leverage technology, especially social networks and the work and the things that are doing there to improve that collaboration. If you think about a simple thing like being able to find out who from your social network, and when I say social network, I'm not talking about Facebook or Twitter, I'm talking about from the people you know. Who from the people you know are actually involved? And then be able to reach out to them and say, can we start doing this? Can you give me this information? And so on. And if we enable that through technology, and yeah, it may sit on top of something like Facebook or LinkedIn or Twitter or whatever, we start enabling real collaboration to happen. We can try to fight it and try to do it like those, 90% of those emergency managers, and try to fight it and do it through the organizations and say, oh, we at this NGO, we're going to work very closely with someone else. No, it's all going to happen because I know you and you know me, and we have created a trust between us. And it would be very interesting to see what would start happening once we start leveraging technology to open up that connection. And that allows us to stop thinking necessarily in the terms of a cluster system or in terms of an institution, but rather start thinking in the terms of people. One of the authors I read, I mentioned earlier, was Clay Shirky, and who wrote The Cognitive Surplus. But if you go back on TED and you look at one of his earlier lectures, he points out to us that the old way of coordination was through institutions. But as communication costs come down, there is another option. And that option is to put the coordination itself into the infrastructure and actually making the coordination of the group a byproduct of actually doing that process. So let's think about how that would affect the cluster model if I stop doing it in the way I have done it before, by calling a meeting, getting everybody into a room, and then I ask every single one of you to report what you're doing, and then by that time, usually the time is over. When I start to say, okay, but we need to figure out this and that. Actually, 90% of what happens, of the coordination that happens in cluster meetings, happens before the cluster meeting while people are waiting, and they meet up and they go, oh, what are you doing over there? And after the cluster meeting, it's actually not the meeting itself that is creating the coordination. So let's try to figure out innovative ways to utilize technology to enable that communication to work better. Oops, jumping ahead of myself. So, and let's move this one as well. Hang on. And I already spoke to what was on that slide. So, this old way of doing things through a cluster model also had a big issue with it. If someone running a cluster was doing a good job, basically what they were doing was they were creating a good matrix of needs and the response, and figuring out, who can meet those needs. And if there was a checkbox everywhere, that meant that there was no gap. And if there was two checkboxes or two check marks inside one of the boxes, that meant there was a duplication of effort. And that was basically what a cluster lead was responsible for. And then summarizing it up and sending it into a situational report. But a lot of that was also based on trying to figure out what the needs were. And let me tell you how a needs assessment in reality works in the field. You go out and first you spend a few days at least to agree upon what questions you're going to ask the community. Now, if you're lucky, the cluster is actually coming up with this together and not everybody going out, and doing individual needs assessment again and again and again. So once you've agreed upon a rapid joint assessment with 110 questions, and I keep asking them what's so rapid about 110 questions, but they don't want to answer that one. They then go ahead and, because we still haven't standardized how we want to do these things, we still haven't come up with good computer-enabled data collection. So we actually send teams out there with pieces of paper and we start filling it out. And then when we come back, in some cases we'll have lots of people typing up all the results and creating a database and then telling us where there are needs. In many ways, that's similar to like looking at all the social media reports that we talked about in Haiti. And by the time we finally got them to the response organization, someone had actually already done what was needed. So they told us when we were asking them, how accurate were these reports that you were getting in through all the systems? They said, well, in about 90% of the cases, they had actually been handled by the time we got there. So we need to figure out a way, because that's the same thing with a needs assessment. By the time it's been entered and analyzed and processed and all that stuff, it's actually become outdated. But it's still the key thing that we use as a planning tool. So we need to figure out ways to get that data from the affected communities much sooner, in a much more structured manner, so that we can more quickly utilize it. And we don't need to ask them 110 questions, okay? Our problem is that the people who work in the humanitarian response organizations They love to be able to have every single answer to every single question. Well, guess what? That's okay 2 months into a disaster. Then we have time for that. But in the beginning, all we need to know is how many people and approximately how big of a percentage is affected. There was a good story I heard once of Jan Egeland, who used to be the head of OSHA, and did a great job as such. And he was once giving a speech or a press conference, and he was asked a question about how big a percentage or big portion of the affected people were children and women. And he answered, 60%. And apparently you could see all the aides in the back going, where did he get that number from? And after the press conference, he was asked, where did you get that number? It wasn't in the briefing papers we gave you. He said, it's always 60%. Okay? Some things are good enough for our planning that we can actually move ahead with them. We don't need to ask the 200 questions. And let's start, when we're trying to take this crowdsourced data, it's so crucial that we start from the other end. We've started in Haiti and other places. We always start with collecting all the data in the world. And then we try to figure out how we're going to use that data. We need to start from the end and think, how are we going to use, what are the decisions we need to make? Okay? Then we can work our way back to figure out what we're going to collect. And sometimes the decisions are only 5 or 6 that we need to make. Then we only need to collect those 5 or 6 things. And today, in the cluster model, as I said earlier, we're creating this matrix, we're reporting what's the need and so on, but we're not scaling it out, and that's the problem. It doesn't scale out when you have a big disaster. And I come from the urban search and rescue world, and we have realized that this model doesn't scale. If we were the ones giving out all of the commands or giving out all of the tasks, it doesn't work. So what we did was we simply divided the affected area up into what we call sectors, and then we said, okay, who wants to be working where based on the need? We made sure there was at least one strong team in each one of the areas that we give a leadership role. Now, when I say leadership, I'm not talking about command and control role, but rather someone who then works with the other teams to figure out what are the tasks within that area. Okay? And because in the urban search and rescue world we have standardized, so we know each other's capacity and capabilities, we can actually start breaking up our teams and putting them together in different ways and working together in those areas, because I know if someone says that they have a dog team that has been classified as we call it, I know what they're capable of. I know I can trust them. I know it's not just any dog team that's coming in. It's someone who meets a certain basic criteria. And thereby, for example, in Haiti, when I was leading the Icelandic team, we didn't have dogs. We're not allowed to bring them back for quarantine reasons, so we don't take them out. So we accepted teams, dog teams, to be part of our team in there because we had this standardization. So we need to start working on that and then figuring out, are there ways in which we can scale this out? And I think we can learn from how the ICS model, the Incident Command System model here in the U.S., thinks about scaling out from a geographical point of view, where they split things up. And I'm not saying we should have the command and control structure that they have, but this idea of spanning things out geographically is something that we need to put into everything we do. And technology can certainly help us there. The next item I wanted to talk about is openness. And in today's world, we are actually spending a lot of effort into making sure that the work we're doing is accountable. And we spend almost, if you go into the field and you see the number of headcounts working on reports for donors, it's amazing. Okay? And why is that? Well, we had decades of money just flowing, and nobody cared. And there was lots of corruption, and there was not a lot of, things that happened. So our model was, let's put, the strictest thing we can on that. Well, just like we've seen in the financial world, you can't have it all free, you can't have it all very strict. You have to find some golden middle ground. And one of the things that we kind of believe in is that if we could push organizations to simply be more open about the data that they're creating, and I'm not just talking about financial data, but also their operational data. Now, I'm not talking about privacy-related data, just to clear that out, but all the other data, if that became public, and I mean really public, if I didn't just see that WFP got from USAID 20 million to work on Horn of Africa, but I could actually not only look at how their project plans were, but actually also see what the spending against that was. Having that public would make it a lot more transparent and a lot more accountable than it is today. And this is actually something that we're also seeing in the corporate world. And in this new age of network intelligence, where we can get anybody to look at this kind of data, this form of transparency is actually very powerful. I think it was last week or a couple of weeks ago, 45 governments around the world announced the Open Government Partnership, which is about sharing data. I found one example they gave very interesting where I think it was Brazil or it was, at least it was a developing country, who puts the expense reports of all government employees online within 24 hours of them being submitted to help fight the corruption. Imagine when someone starts then digging into what is the spending actually going towards. And imagine what would happen if all these humanitarian organizations started doing this, started sharing information. As I said earlier, we used to have the excuse that we couldn't because of connectivity. Now we can. But we are still keeping the data very close to us, even simple data like the results of those assessments. And if we publish them, we make sure we publish them as doc files or PDFs or maps so that nobody can take them except if they sit for just as long time as it took us to enter the needs assessment forms in to recreate that data. And also think about and imagine what would happen if that kind of data became available to the academic community, who would then start looking at it and thinking of new ways. And we've seen the first few steps happen in this. USAID, as said a couple of weeks ago, released all of the food price data for Horn of Africa that they have collected for the last few years and made them openly available. Why? Because they said, in order to address food security, we need the collaborative minds to look at this, of everyone, and figure out new and innovative ways to address those issues. I'm going to skip that one and move to integrity. In the essence of time. that same openness allows us also to improve the integrity of the work we're doing. As this great quote says, integrity is doing the right thing even when nobody is watching. Well, I want to say that I don't think we live in a world anymore where nobody is watching. Because today, our beneficiaries are watching what we're doing, and citizen reporters are very quick at reporting anything that happens. And we've had examples from Pakistan during the floods last year where Save the Children put up a mobile phone hotline for reporting any issues with their work. And there were some great results that came out of that to improve the integrity of that work. And that's a model we can definitely take to other places to look at how we deal with integrity and improve the integrity of the work we're doing. And the last thing I wanted to kind of mention is self-organization. In a disaster, following a disaster, any of you have ever been immediately after a disaster to the field know that it is the most chaotic environment you can get into. Yet, we attempt in the humanitarian world to put a hierarchical model on top of that. And we've been trying to do the same thing in multiple areas. And one of the books I mentioned, or papers I mentioned earlier, was Power to the Edge, which actually is looking at the military and looking at how their mechanism of command and control needs to be adapted for this new information age we live in. And what they say in that paper is, because we now have the ability to take information and bring it to the edge, as they call it, to the field workers, they can start making tactical decisions that we couldn't before. And the old model of running a war from the headquarters and the soldiers simply did what they were told to do is no longer working. Strategic direction needs to come from headquarters, but the tactical decision-making can now happen in the field, by the field workers, because we can now provide them with enough information about the overall situation that they can then take that and add to that their input from what they're seeing and make those decisions. So we need to think about how we adapt this new model to the work we're doing and empower the field workers to start doing more. And when you start thinking about that, you can even take it a bit further. And you can start thinking about what would actually happen if we not just provide that information to the humanitarian organizations, but also to the affected communities. And those affected communities can then start seeing where there's need for certain things and can start self-organizing to meet those needs themselves, or start asking for those needs to be met by the humanitarian community. And I believe that we will start seeing as we move forward, and this may not be a year from now or 5 years from now or 10 years from now, but I think we'll start to see much more of a self-organization happening in the field, where people from different organizations will be working together. And if we identify an area for them to work. We say, please, Mr. Save the Children, can you work in the area in Leogane? Through the relationships they have with people in other organizations, if they do not have the expertise or the resources to meet a particular need in that area, they know how to reach out to them through that social network that they have and bring in that expertise. And that all happens without a single cluster meeting, without a single situation report having to be sent and processed and all of that. Just going to move everybody to the same page. I hope that some of the ideas you've heard me say here today about where I see the humanitarian response system going, I've gotten you to start thinking that there might be different ways, that we may need to change the models that we have been utilizing to address these complex problems we are facing. Some of the things I may have mentioned may be a bit radical for today, especially if you're from the humanitarian world where you want to make sure you're keeping your job. But I think what we will see is that as the digital generation that is soon going to start relieving us old-timers in the humanitarian business, we're going to see more of them getting implemented. And the old dogs like me and others in this room, we have to maybe think about how we're going to help that digital generation to do this in a manner that is more appropriate than what they necessarily see as the radical change. Where, if I speak to a crowdsourced person today, they tell me, oh, the solution to everything is crowdsourcing it. And I go like, no. And then if I talk to the humanitarian, it's like, nothing will change. We will do it as it is. Well, now is the time for those two generations to start talking to each other. And that's why I'm ending with this quote, that we got to remember that the organizations and the crowdsourced community are going to be the two different extremes maybe for now. But it's down to us, the people in this room, the people online, to start making those changes and start pushing them forward. And maybe if we take some of this, it'll lead to at least some of the organizations starting to think a bit differently about the work that we're doing. And now we're open for questions.
Okay, I'll pass this around. Do you want to hand me the mic?
Sure. Here's the... I'm thinking whether we should also enable... yeah, you're all unmuted now online. Just wanted to let you know that we will be taking questions from the online, but we'll start here in the room and then we'll move online. So I'll put you all on mute for now, but then please raise your hand. There's like a raise hand feature in here somewhere. And then I'll unmute you. Thank you.
I was wondering if you have other examples of ways in which technology and especially crowdsourcing has been used successfully in the field, even if in a small way.
There are certainly good examples that we have. We've learned a lot since Haiti. I often point towards, when I'm asked a similar question to this, I often point to the work that was done around Libya, where in the first days of the civil war in Libya, there was a lot of refugees coming out of Libya and moving to neighboring countries. But because Libya had not been a country where the UN had big presence or any of the big NGOs, there was actually very little information about what was happening. So through great collaboration between the humanitarian community, where certain people who, some of them happened to be online, took great risk in trying another new model, they got a group of digital volunteers, as I like to call them, this volunteer standby task force and others, to come and help monitor what was coming out of the traditional media, social media, and the reports coming out from the humanitarian organizations and media organizations, and create a map, what we call the Libya crisis map, for having a way to view all of that. Now, that's something that no single organization could have created, but because a number of organizations worked together, and I think it was close to 600 volunteers who spent a lot of time over a 6-week period, that became a good example of how one thing which was getting an overview of the situation could be addressed through new technology. Now, could it have been done better? Yes. Could it have been so that it was even more better things that could have been made out of it from like, was it actionable? Was it enough for making the decisions that had to be made? I'm sure it could have done better. Could we have involved more organizations? Yes, we could. But it was a good first or second step. I would say Haiti was probably the first step. I also, for those that are in the more academic community or who hold some money to fund some studies, I think we actually need to look very closely at what happened in Japan. Our problem is that we don't understand it. Because most of it was done in Japanese, by Japanese people. And it was very much local driven. It was very much, taking some of the lessons from other disasters and moving that into a new culture that was very technologically advanced. And we need to look at and learn what actually happened there and understand it in more detail. We've had, short presentations by some of the people who have done it, but nobody looked at it in the same kind of detail as Haiti was looked at or anything like that. So I definitely think there are.
Thank you. I'd love to talk to you later about Tokyo Hackerspace, where a bunch of fabulously intelligent polyglots would help you find out about what happened there.
Cool. As we're dealing with technical problems with microphones, let's continue.
Yeah, the technology of the microphone is above my head. That is not a good sign. I agree with you that handing out cheap phones to individuals and maybe using applications like M-Pesa is really interesting and has great potential, but often power can be a problem. I wondered if there are good solutions to the problem of recharging those phones that people have found.
Yeah, I'm gonna take the example that Craig Fugate gave just as he returned from his Haiti trip, and he said, we come from a world where we're used to having power plugs and everything, and we can always go, and plug something into the wall, and if electricity goes away, it's at max for 24 hours. We had winter storm in the U.S. In Seattle a year ago or 2 years ago, where some areas were without power for 2 weeks, and it was a massive disaster. Come on, we've lived without energy before. Well, the example he gave was from Haiti. He showed a picture of how people had converted a power strip and car batteries into a charging station for mobile phones. And he added as a comment, I'm not so sure we in the Western world would have figured out how to do that. But they had probably been doing it for the last 30 years. So there are certainly ways, and especially when you're in the developing world, where they find innovative ways to solve that issue. But I think also we need to think about things like solar charging, solar panels, and other simple ways of getting that electricity. And interestingly enough, mobile charging stations and the refugee camps are actually a business. So you bring your phone in, you charge it, and that's because that's someone who is connected to either a solar panel or whatever to get that. And it becomes a little business, and you send a few M-Pesa cents over for that thing. So where there's a will, there's a way, is a good old saying. A couple of more questions, and then we'll get one online. So please raise your hand if you figure out how to do that. If not, send me a private message.
Gisli, thank you for being here with us today. My question is actually, since location is such an important data point in needs assessments, especially if you're moving to a model that's more decentralized and location-based, I was wondering if you had seen any movement among telecoms or mobile phone providers in helping provide some of that location-based data through triangulation and other means during disasters.
Yeah, I can give you one example that I know quite well, which is from Haiti. It's not during the earthquake, it's actually during the cholera outbreak, where location-based data and location-based messaging was provided from Voila, which is one of the mobile operators there, to the IFRC, the Red Cross, to send out hygiene information, to send out location about where the cholera facilities were, what the information about what the symptoms of cholera look like, and so on. And that was all done in very close cooperation with the mobile operator, because it is actually very, very important to be able to work closely with the mobile operators, and they understand that. And the GSMA Association, which is the kind of the association of all the mobile operators, is looking at how they can, in a more concrete way, open that up to the humanitarian community, while at the same time ensuring the privacy issues and all the other stuff that you need to think about. So that's definitely one of the areas that's being worked on, and they're now much more open to that, and seeing some of that research, like the research that came out of Karolinska Institute in Sweden, where they took that location information of all the mobile phones after the Haiti earthquake to analyze where the IDP camps, were kind of coming together. Extremely interesting, and we need to, really get the academic community behind us in figuring out how we can utilize that in very innovative ways to start targeting our aid in a much more effective way than we have before. So we don't have like the little cartoon I showed of the guy with all the gizmos, but no, sorry, I don't know where we're going to distribute.
Hello. I actually got to type some of this out. I do a lot of work with hacker and maker spaces and getting those communities to use their powers for more than just making lights blink, but actually maybe doing some awesome things. So I didn't have anything to do with the Tokyo hackerspace doing the Arduino-powered radiation sensors, but it was really cool to see that come out of a community like that. And the thing that people who are into crowdsourcing forget is that those things work because of the infrastructure they're created on. And I think that that's something that will bridge that gap, is the people who have the historical knowledge of what's needed and how things tend to go, saying, these infrastructures will work and these won't, while still having the people who are not yet quite so jaded, myself included, dumping a bunch of information and passion and desire into, let's try new things all the time. So I don't really know where to go with this, except that I'm excited to help bridge that in some way, however I can, and we'll talk more, I'm sure. So.
Yeah. Maybe just to follow up on that, I mean, one of the things that I've been interacting with these communities also for quite some time, and one of the things I see all this passion. I mean, all this passion by developers and geeks and mappers and so on who really want to help out, and they just want to spend a heck of a lot more time than they should be, but that's human nature. We all want to help. I mean, I got asked all the time when I was doing search and rescue in Iceland, why do you do this thing? And I always answered, well, it's the smile on the faces of parents when we bring back their lost children. It's the smile on the face of the children when we bring back the lost parents. I can tell you the smile on the family of the persons we saved in Haiti out of the rubble are going to keep me doing this stuff for the next 10, 15 years. And it's the same with the hackers. They really want to, feel that and help and feel like they're doing. And we need to figure out how we can harness that passion and push it in the right direction. And we need to realize that solutions created during a disaster usually don't get used. I just to give you why not. Why doesn't it work to bring new technology during the middle of a disaster? I asked someone who had been, very seasoned and doing a lot of these things, and she said, it's the 5-minute rule. If I can't learn how to use it in 5 minutes, I'm going to throw it away. That's my attention span. If it can save me lots of time and it can do great things for me, but it takes me more than 5 minutes to learn how to use it, I'm not going to use it. So that's very difficult, though, for us from the techie space to figure out how to create a solution that you can actually use in 5 minutes.
Like 30 seconds during the event?
It even has to go down to that. So but again, these things, we need to figure out how do we harness that energy during the peace times, in between the disasters. And then through that, get very creative and innovative things created that today the NGO community, the UN community, and others cannot afford to create themselves and doesn't exist out there already.
You mentioned the Open Government Partnership. What are your thoughts? It seems as if the U.S. plan had much more about development aid in there than I expected. What are your thoughts on, I think it's humanrights.gov, and there was another development-focused site in there on their capacity to do some of what you were talking about before in terms of networking information that people are getting on the ground?
My vision, and one of the things that I'm working towards, is that we bring all the different actors together and start creating a similar initiative for the humanitarian world. And not only bring in the government data, but also bring in the operational data from the humanitarian response organizations. And we start bringing all of that together. And then we can bring in the hackers and figure out how can we look at these data in different new ways. Bring in the academic community and do analysis on the data that we never have time for in the humanitarian world. And I don't see that as a technology problem. We know how to do that. It's a policy thing. To get those organizations to start sharing data, it's going to be difficult. But I think if we do it in the right manner and with the right incentives for them, like the World Bank does today, that You have to share the data that you create for them openly. Otherwise, you don't get the funding. That's a very good incentive, I think. But that's new. So we need to start thinking, is that maybe what some of the donors need to start doing, is to think in that way. To put a clause in there is that if you create data that's, not the privacy related, but all the other stuff, that should be shared with everybody else. Okay, that's one way of implementing policy. Let's see.
Gisli, thank you. I would like to ask a question on the sense of control and of wisdom. What we have with the change to this world where the beneficiaries and more citizens are engaging in sort of transnational exchanges on how to help each other, there's a sense of loss of control that's happening with the formal institutions. They want to reinstitute and pull that control lever to get this all back. And yet that's probably going to have exactly the opposite actual effect when they pull it. And yet the old-style humanitarians have embedded a great deal of wisdom inside of their processes. And there are things that are not yet integrated into the new ways of doing things, nor necessarily from the sense of the affected populations integrated into the emergent things that they're now doing with mobile phones. How do we create that interface so that the wisdom from the one generation gets embedded in the new ways?
I think that was partially what the good old report you wrote was an example of that, the Disaster Response 2.0 report. But I think what is needed is a shift in mindset, especially from the top in the humanitarian organizations, saying that these are new and innovative ways to use this, but we're going to lose every control we have if we don't go there and start working with these organizations. And what's happening right now within a lot of those humanitarian organizations, it's actually the grassroots, it's the field workers or not necessarily the top that is coming in and saying, social media is great. Let's figure out a way to use it. I mean, even if you look at an organization like UNOCHA, it's less than 6 months they started using Twitter. You need a different mindset. And once you have that mindset, you need to start creating that forum for people to work together. And that forum cannot be that we simply work together when a disaster strikes. It needs to be something that we work towards all the time. And that takes money, and that takes effort, and that is something that the donor community needs to remember, that needs funding. And I think one of the groups we need to have on board on this are not just the two I've mentioned, but also the donor community itself. We need to get them to realize that they can make the work of the humanitarian response organizations more effective if they use technology, if they leverage some of these things. And more effective means better use of their money. And with the money available for humanitarian aid going down because of economical situations around the world, we need to, just like we've done in government work everywhere else, find more efficient ways of doing things. And I think if we use that argument towards them, and we bring all of these together and we put our smartest minds around this from both generations, we can definitely find ways to make it work. But it cannot be ad hoc. It has to be something we work on, and we bring in everybody, including private sector, technology companies, and so on. And we simply say, let's figure out a way to do it together. Let's stop trying to compete around this or do tiny little pilots here and there that never get anywhere. Let's try to do it as a big solution. So far, nobody online who raises their hands. I'm going to put you a few seconds off mute in case anybody there wants to ask. You're now all, I can now hear all of you. Any questions online? Everybody.
Just thank you. It was a great talk.
Thank you. Okay, we'll then continue questions here. I'm going to put you all on mute so we don't hear you chatting away. Okay, Steve?
Can you go back to the OpenStreetMap slide for a second?
OpenStreet. Oh, it was actually a.
Okay, well. Yeah. So the.
On an OSM map.
Yeah,
That's correct.
I think you. I think you raised a good point looking at the perspective of instead of data, looking at the perspective of what decisions need to be taken. Whether I'm coming at this from a response perspective or even just as a manager. I remember, back 15 years ago when PowerPoint first came out, it was a competition to see how many words and lines we can put on a single slide. And it created a whole mess because we kept trying to push all kinds of ideas. And when I look at this, really the only visual I can see is that there's probably a lot more enthusiastic people with phones down at the southern end of the map and in the northwest section of the map, and not so many enthusiastic people with phones on the eastern side of the map. That's about the only information this conveys. And knowing the way Shahidi is built, I know that each of those bubbles represents completely dissimilar things. So it's not 12 of the same item. It's 12 data points. So they almost came at this and said, let's see how much information we can possibly cram into a map. Oh, geez, we can't fit that many icons, so let's condense it. To the point that it's meaningless. You can't make a decision off of this. So I think you're right. There's so much enthusiasm. They want to come at this, and there's almost a goal of how much information can we possibly put on a map. Where I think if we can get that message out, that instead of worrying about how much information can we get on a map, what decisions do we need to take, and what's the minimal information that we need to have on a map to be able to do that?
I would even take this a bit further. I want to say that you start with a decision. So once we've identified what is the decision we're trying to make, then you should think about what visualization do I need to be able to make that decision. Now, that visualization may not even be a map. It may be a graph, it may be a table, it may be all kinds of different things. And we've had too much focus on one way of representing data as a map. Yeah, I know it's fantastic that we now have phones that have geospatial things and so on, but it's not the only way to look at things. And we need to, once we have the visualizations defined that we need for the decisions, then we can think about what's the analysis that we need to do to get to that visualization. What's the processing we need to do before we can do that analysis? And then we can start collecting data. So, very true in what you say is that is not the only way and may not even be the way to make the best decisions. Besides, how are you going to get that great-looking map to run across the low bandwidth and high latency we have and occasionally connected environment we're in the field? That's another thing we haven't, addressed yet. I know you're working on it.
Hi, and thank you.
Okay, hang on. Okay, Andre.
Yeah, my comment to what sometimes I call the meso map of Ushahidi, and what we told them, as we were working with this on Libya, was it's actually the data that's behind all those that is really the gold mine. And we were actually, we took all of this data and we were actually extracting it on a daily basis and using it in other products. So the regular OCHA infographics that were being produced, and put up on the wall in the Libya boardrooms was being produced into the 3W reports. We were actually using the data a lot. We were actually pulling it out and performing different types of analysis on it to try to see what kind of ways we could actually slice and dice it. So even if the map doesn't necessarily appear so beautiful when it's a bunch of red dots, there is the big map feature, which was quite helpful. But then it is the fact that we have all that data. You know, you get into these concepts of big data and all these kind of things, and perhaps it isn't that we need to control what they collect, but you know, figure out ways to categorize it properly and slice it for our use.
Thanks, Andre. And that was Andre Verity at UNOCHA, who is one of the people who's been leading within the UN community the use of crowdsourced data and led the Libya crisis map. So great input, Andre. No, go ahead here.
Thanks. I want to thank you for a fascinating presentation. I think and the questions have been excellent. I have a question related to that past comment and then the previous question. Last year or the year before, the Washington Post put out a horrifying expose on the collection of intelligence information by, I don't know if you read it, it was great, by a variety of, just on the U.S. side, variety of agencies. And they said the technology that we have at our disposal now allows us to collect so much information from so many resources that these organizations are completely overwhelmed. There are several organizations looking at the same data at the same time, not talking to each other, and just the volume of it is overwhelming. I'm anticipating that this type of problem may happen to the humanitarian world as well. Who are the gatekeepers? Where's the quality control? And how is this could become, again, so overwhelming in terms of the information coming in that it would be paralysis, and we just go back to the old ways of running around in the field, getting some anecdotal information and acting on it, which is what we do most of the time anyway.
I think definitely what we're seeing, and that's maybe what's scaring a lot of the humanitarian organizations away, is this information overload. They're already overloaded with information. But where I see the real opportunity is using things like crowdsourcing to actually process and analyze data. To be able to, instead of just doing that in the field like we've done in the past, to actually be able to send that out to 600 volunteers around the world who can do that for us. But at the same time, we can't push them and tell them, oh, try to drink out of the fire hose that's called Twitter. You know, even if you filter it by a hashtag or something like that, that's still going to give you too much information. And that's why I think, again, I keep going back to this, you know, let's start from the other end. And then I'll use that to filter exactly what the information is that we want to be looking at, instead of trying to say, let's look at everything that's happening in Libya and let's try to figure out how we categorize that and put that on a map. You know, let's just take the ones that say, you know, Libya and refugee, for example, and let's start looking at those. And then all of a sudden you've minimized the amount of data you're looking at. But we also need to look at, you know, intelligent ways of utilizing technology for doing that. And there's been some work like Swift River with Ushahidi and others. We don't know if it's going to actually deliver what it's promising. But it's definitely is, you know, a step in the right direction. But I think we need to be much better at filtering ourselves what we want to be seeing, and not always looking at, oh, there's so much data out there, I really want to add everybody on Google Plus to my Google Plus circles, because then I'm not going to miss anything in the world. Well, guess what happens? All of a sudden you miss everything that's happening. So you got to find that middle ground, and taking the wisdom of you know, the crowds or of the older generation, we should be providing that wisdom of what we need to filter down to the digital generation, that even though they may have 4 screens and be able to watch, you know, all the different streams coming out at the same time, you know, they're not managing to take that and then push the right things out. So we need to figure out how to do that. or start breeding little children very early on to do that filtering for us and only doing that. No, I'm kidding.
Hi, I'm Tak Takalowski. Thank you for your talk. I have a question about how a small company would go out and get involved with this, because you mentioned that it's too late to do it when it's in the field. You can't introduce new technology then. I'm working with a German manufacturer who makes a do-it-yourself Street View camera. It's basically Google Street View, but it's a relatively, not cheap, but relatively inexpensive. I've combined it with software that allows you to annotate it. It can be deployed to Turk, so if you figure out what you want. I think it would make perfect sense in a crisis situation to go down, take as many pictures as you can, even if you don't have much of an internet connection, deploy them out to Turk, out to the web, out to Amazon's S3 or wherever it needs to go. My question is, how does a small company like I've been working with Jan, who's actually one of the people who's on the call you're looking at. How do we go about reaching out to the community and getting funding, support, training, so that when the crisis comes, we don't hey, look at this panoramic camera we have. Why don't you use it in the field? I don't understand. How do we get there ahead of time?
I think this is a question we very often see, and it's the same issue we have, with the hacker space, kind of the hackers community. We need to take that passion that companies have, private sector companies have, that the crowds have, and so on, and we need to have a more structured way of harnessing that. And we had a good discussion before the talk here with around crisis commons and how that kind of concept can move forward and work in towards that. And I think that we need to find ways to open up for solutions like you're talking about. And there are millions of companies that we could be leveraging the corporate social responsibility, feelings of those organizations, but we're not. And very often it is because the companies don't know where to go and how to get involved. My kind of suggestion to anybody that wants to start doing these kind of things, and that doesn't matter whether it's a private sector company or a group of hackers somewhere, is find an organization, preferably one that's close to you geographically, and approach them and say, here's something we want to try out. Is that something you're willing to do? And, do it first just on a very non-committal basis, like figure out how to work together. Learn to understand the interaction model that you have to have with this different set of organizations called humanitarian organizations. What makes us tick? And we need to learn what makes you tick. And once you've gotten there, start introducing it, start talking about it, getting those organizations to start talking about the use of that technology at, some of the events that we have within our community. And that's how very many of the smaller companies have gotten into working with our member organizations in NetHope, for example. And you don't have to be a Cisco or a Microsoft or an Apple to work with the NGOs. It's actually the best work happens locally and with local groups. And if you have a difficult time finding someone locally, reach out to some of these places like us at NetHope or other, where we can direct you in the right way and say, well, if you're in Germany, well, you should be talking to my colleagues at Technische Hilfswerke, which is, a great organization that does urban search and rescue. And I could tell you that kind of a camera thing would be great for doing analysis of the effects of an earthquake on an area. No, I'm just giving a wild example, but we have talked about this, doing these kind of things. But we need to try them out in exercises, in all kinds of things. And I think one of the things I'm missing is that we used to have this great thing called Strong Angel, that was organized by Eric Rasmussen a few years back, where we brought together the humanitarian community and the technology community. And for a few days, they got to play together, learn how each other worked, learn how to interact with each other within, how does one humanitarian organization work with another? How does Google work with Microsoft? Those kind of dangerous things. And to do it around a scenario, a concept where, internet is off, electricity is off. That was the first two things. And it took them about, 36 hours to get the internet back up and running? And fully, never fully. But we need that kind of a space to try out that technology, because we can try things out during exercises that we, are not risking the lives of people, except those playing with the power. But anyway.
So we're coming close to the end of our time. I'm going to have one more question. Dennis has been waiting here patiently, and then if we could wrap it up.
Sure.
So.
Yeah, well, I just want to follow up on some of the other previous comments. And I'm writing a piece now on I think what we're talking about is a culture clash between the two communities. And just like whenever you have two communities that have divergent cultures, you can't really convert them. The best you can hope for is sort of an understanding of each other's sort of cultures. And I think speaking as a member of the Humanitarian Muggles community, it's run on certain humanitarian principles of verifiability and accountability and neutrality and those types of principles that this other community isn't think of first, isn't sort of run on in sort of a natural type of response to when they're used to immediate response and very idealistic and very humanitarian goals, but these other sort of principles that the bureaucratic organizational community is sort of run on is embedded, or at least pay lip service to. So do you have any ideas? I mean, I think you mentioned the Strong Angel, which I think was where you did sort of get these two communities to interact and coexist and at least have a better understanding of each other. Any other ideas on how to get the two communities to come to some sort of collaborative, positive, productive relationship?
Sure. One area that we haven't been good enough at is actually introducing to the digital generation those principles that we work by. Talking of hackers, let's get some smart people in the room to create an interactive way of introducing those principles to the digital generation. Okay? Let's not do it by sending them, a 20-page PDF that they should read. Let's do it in an interactive way. I think we need to do some education on both sides. And we need to have a very open dialogue. And what I would like to see, I mentioned Strong Angel, but I also think, the next time we have an opportunity where the leadership of the humanitarian organizations come together for anything, we should set aside some time, and that's something the donor community can help us do. We should set aside some time and also bring in some of the people who've been leading the kind of next generation, have a very open and frank discussion and interaction between the two, and talk about, why isn't World Food Program using this or that? Why isn't OCHA using this or that? Why isn't the Red Cross using this or that? So we understand that if we're from the technology angle, and then this crowd community, be able to say, why aren't you playing around with crowd? Why are you afraid of crowdsourcing? Why are you afraid of social media? And have that interactive discussion, and let's not do it, it has to be under what are they called? Chatham House rules. Where we say things as they are. Let's not try to kind of, make it any prettier than it is. I always say, about everywhere I go, I always say, I'm Icelandic. I don't know how to be politically correct. Okay? I say things as they are. So I will say to whoever you are, whether you are, Bill Gates or whether you are, head of a UN organization, I talk to you like you're another human being. I don't care who you are. And I say things are stupid if I think they're stupid. And that it has to happen in that, so we kind of get this honest dialogue between the two, and then start to get this from the top also down, because right now we have great people like Andre and others who are doing a fantastic job, but they are the grassroots within those organizations. And even though, they're getting some political support within what they're doing, they're still also just one of the people sitting in an office. They're not the leadership saying, we need to figure out ways to utilize these things.
Having been in both UN and U.S. government bureaucracies, you're right. I think it's the grassroots people who are very receptive to this. And even at the leadership, you have visionaries. Mm-hmm. It's the middle management. It's the middle management that's always very risk averse, very cover your ass, very afraid to do anything that's innovative, and of course, there's no in our hierarchical structure. There's no sort of from the grassroots to the leadership visionaries who are just interested in getting the job done and being more efficient and being more effective for their own personal. It's that middle management, and right now it's sort of. We all have buy-in at the geek level, at the operational level, where we all think it's great ideas, but getting it up to that sort of getting it built into the culture and strategy.
Yeah, and we're seeing this though. We're seeing good examples of this starting to get up. I want to point out the American Red Cross, who are one of the ones who are really embracing social media. In the work that they do. And not only have they, embraced it, but it's going all the way up to the top and through the middle management, who is supporting this, and they're now looking at how they can create digital volunteer groups within, their organizations, of working with the people who work in the, our full-time workers, work with them during times of disasters. If you go back a few years, they were fighting the same battle we are fighting within the humanitarian space. So we should look at some of the great lessons that they have been doing there and start to adapt that to other organizations.
With that, I'm going to end it. And thank you all so much for coming and having a very vibrant conversation. Thank you, Gisli, for joining us and giving us your thoughts and wisdom. I'd like to invite everyone. There's still coffee, cookies, if people would like to continue this conversation informally. And thank you again for coming.
Thank you.